Oh my gosh, we were so close to finishing chapter 3. I didn't look ahead, but whatever. Let's jump right back into it. We're almost done with 3. Then we'll go on to 4. East Hampton will laugh when I tell him this. He warned me not to leave her out, said she'd get the better of me if I did. I wouldn't listen to him. It shows you, though, how damned careful you got to be. I thought I'd taken every precaution against being overheard. I'd satisfied myself beforehand that you and your wife were alone in the flat. I actually heard the voice in the telephone asking your wife to come round at once, and so I was tricked by the old simple device of the bang door. Yes, she's a smart woman, your wife. He was silent for a minute, and then he said, "Tell her from me, will you, that I eat dirt?" That was a question. Tell her from me, will you, that I eat dirt? And I suppose now she's in on this? Mr. Grant made an expressive grimace. She's in on it, whether we like it or not. Tell her the department will esteem it an honor if she will condescend to work with us over the matter. I'll tell her, said Tommy with a faint grin. Grant said seriously, "You couldn't persuade her, I suppose, to go home and stay home?" Tommy shook his head. "You don't know tuppence." "I think I'm beginning to. I said that because, well, it's a dangerous business. If they get wise to you or to her—" He left the sentence unfinished. Tommy said gravely, "I do understand that, sir. But I suppose even you couldn't persuade your wife to keep out of danger." Tommy said slowly, "I don't know that I really would want to do that. Tuppence and I, you see, aren't on those terms. We go into things together." In his mind was that phrase uttered years ago in the close of an earlier war, a joint venture. That was what his life with Tuppence had been and would always be, a joint venture. And that's the end of chapter 3. It's right there on it. So the start of 4. I got so cold. Now I'm burning up in this. When Tuppence entered the lounge at Sansucci just before dinner, the only occupant of the room was the monumental Mrs. O'Rourke, who was sitting by the window looking like some gigantic Buddha. She greeted Tuppence with a lot of geniality and verve. "Ah, now, if it isn't Mrs. Blenkinsop, you're like myself. It pleases you to be down to time and get a quiet minute or two before going into the dining room. And a pleasant room this is in good weather, with the windows open in the way that you'll not be noticing the smell of cooking. Terrible that is in all these places, and more especially if it's onion or cabbage that's on the fire. Sit here now, Mrs. Blenkinsop, and tell me what you've been doing with yourself this fine day, and how you like Lehampton." There was something about Mrs. O'Rourke that had an unholy fascination for Tuppence. She was rather like an ogress dimly remembered from early fairy tales, with her bulk, her deep voice, her unabashed beard and mustache, her deep twinkling eyes, and the impression she gave of being more than life-size. She was indeed not unlike some childhood's fantasy. Tuppence replied that she thought she was going to like Lehampton very much and be happy there. "That is," she added in a melancholy voice, "as happy as I can be anywhere, with this terrible anxiety weighing on me all the time." "Ah, now, don't you be worrying yourself," Mrs. O'Rourke advised comfortably. "Those boys of yours will come back to you safe and sound, not a doubt of it. One of them's in the Air Force, so I think you said?" "Yes, Raymond." "And he's in France now, or England?" "He's in Egypt at the moment, but from what he said in his last letter, not exactly said, but we have a little private code, if you know what I mean. Certain sentences mean certain things. I think that's quite justified, don't you? Mrs. O'Rourke replied promptly. Indeed I do. 'Tis a mother's privilege. Yes, you see, I feel I must know just where he is. Mrs. O'Rourke nodded her Buddha-like head. I feel for you entirely, so I do. If I had a boy out there, I'd be deceiving the censor in the very same way, so I would. And your other boy, the one in the Navy? Tuppence entered obligingly upon a saga of Douglas. You see, she cried, I feel so lost without my 3 boys. They've never been all the way together from me before. They're all so sweet to me. I really do think they treat me more as a friend than a mother. She laughed self-consciously. I have to scold them sometimes and make them go without me. What a pestilential woman I sound, thought Tuppence to herself. She went on aloud, and I really didn't quite know what to do or where to go. The lease of my house in London was up, and it seemed so foolish to renew it, and I thought if I came somewhere quiet, and yet with a good train service. She broke off. Again the Buddha nodded. I agree with you entirely. London is no place at present. Ah, the gloom of it. I've lived there myself for many a year now. I'm by way of being an antique dealer, you know. You may know my shop in Cornaby Street, Chelsea. Kate Kelly's the name over the door. Lovely stuff I had there, too. Oh, lovely stuff. Mostly glass. Waterford, cork. Beautiful. Chandeliers and lustres and punch bowls and all the rest of it. Foreign glass, too, and small furniture. Nothing large. Just small period pieces. Mostly walnut and oak. Oh, lovely stuff. And I had some good customers. But there, when there's a war on, all that goes west. I'm lucky to be out of it with as little loss as I've had. A faint memory flickered through Tuppence's mind. A shop filled with glass through which it was difficult to move. A rich, persuasive voice, a compelling, massive woman. Yes, surely she had been into that shop. Mrs. O'Rourke went on. I'm not one of those that like to be always complaining, not like some that's in this house. Mr. Cayley, for one, with his muffler and his shawls and his moans about his business going to pieces. Of course it's to pieces. There's a war on, and his wife, with never boo to say to a goose. Then there's that little Mrs. Sprott, always fussing about her husband. Is he out at the front? Not he. He's a tuppenny halfpenny clerk in an insurance office, that's all, and so terrified of air raids, he's had his wife down here since the beginning of the war. Mind you, I think that's right where the child's concerned, and a nice wee mite she is, but Mrs. Sprott, she frets. For all that her husband comes down when he can, keeps saying Arthur must miss her so. But if you ask me, Arthur's not missing her over much. Maybe he's got other fish to fry. Tuppence murmured, I'm terribly sorry for all these mothers. If you let your children go away without you, you never stop worrying. And if you go with them, it's hard on the husbands being left. Ah, yes. And it comes expensive running 2 establishments. This place seems quite reasonable, said Tuppence. Yes, I'd say you get your money's worth. Mrs. Perrenna's a good manager. There's a queer woman for you now. In what way? Asked Tuppence. Mrs. O'Rourke said with a twinkle. You'll be thinking I'm a terrible talker. It's true. I'm interested in all my fellow creatures. That's why I sit in this chair as often as I can. You see who goes in and who goes out, and who's on the veranda, and what goes on in the garden. What were we talking of now? Ah, yes. Mrs. Perenna and the queerness of her. There's been a grand drama in that woman's life, or I'm much mistaken. Do you really think so? I do now. and the mystery she makes of herself. And where might you come from in Ireland, I asked her, and would you believe it? She held out on me, declaring she was not from Ireland at all. You think she's Irish? Of course she's Irish. I know my own country women. I could name you the county she comes from, but there, I'm English, she says, and my husband was a Spaniard. Mrs. O'Rourke broke off abruptly as Mrs. Sprott came in, closely followed by Tommy. Tuppence immediately assumed a sprightly manner. Good evening, Mr. Meadows. You look very brisk this evening. Tommy said, plenty of exercise. That's the secret. A round of golf this morning and a walk along the front this afternoon. Millicent Sprott said, I took baby down to the beach this afternoon. She wanted to paddle, but I really thought it was rather cold. I was helping her build a castle. And a dog ran off with my knitting and pulled out yards of it. So annoying, and so difficult picking up all the stitches again. I'm such a bad knitter. I could be all sandy, too. You're getting along fine with that helmet, Mrs. Blenkinsop, said Mrs. O'Rourke, suddenly turning her attention to Tuppence. You've been just racing along. I thought Miss Minton said you were an inexperienced knitter. Tuppence flushed faintly. Mrs. O'Rourke's eyes were sharp with a slightly vexed air. Tuppence said, I've really done quite a lot of knitting. I told Miss Minton so, but I think she likes teaching people. Everybody laughed in agreement, and a few minutes later the rest of the party came in and the gong was sounded. The conversation during the meal turned on the absorbing subject of spies. Well-known hoary chestnuts were retold. The nun with the muscular arm, the clergyman descending from his parachute and using unclergyman-like language as he landed with a bump. The Austrian cook who secreted a wireless in her bedroom chimney, and all the things that had happened, or nearly happened, to aunts and second cousins of those present. That led easily to fifth column activities, to denunciations of the British fascists, of the communists, of the Peace Party, of conscientious objectors. It was a very normal conversation of the kind that may be heard almost every day. Nevertheless, Tuppence watched keenly the faces and demeanor of the people as they talked, striving to catch some telltale expression or word, but there was nothing. Sheila Perrina alone took no part in the conversation, but that might be put down to her habitual taciturnity. She sat there, her dark, rebellious face sullen and brooding. Carl von Dienham was out tonight, so tongues could be quite unrestrained. Sheila only spoke once toward the end of dinner. Mrs. Sprott had just said in her thin, fluting voice, Where do I think the Germans made such a mistake in the last war was to shoot Nurse Cavell. It turned everybody against them. It was then that Sheila, flinging back her head, demanded in her fierce young voice, Why shouldn't they shoot her? She was a spy, wasn't she? Oh, no, not a spy. She helped English people to escape. In an enemy country, that's the same thing. Why shouldn't she be shot? Oh, but shooting a woman and a nurse? Sheila got up. I think the Germans were quite right, she said. She went out of the window into the garden. Dessert consisting of some underripe bananas and some tired oranges had been on the table some time. Everyone rose and adjourned to the lounge for coffee. Only Tommy unobtrusively betook himself to the garden. He found Sheila Perrina leaning over the terrace wall, staring out at the sea. He came and stood beside her. By her hurried, quick breathing, he knew that something had upset her badly. He offered her a cigarette, which she accepted. He said, "Lovely night." In a low, intense voice, the girl answered, "It could be." Tommy looked at her doubtfully. He felt suddenly the attraction and the vitality of this girl. There was a tumultuous life in her, a kind of compelling power. She was the kind of girl, he thought, that a man might easily lose his head over. "If it weren't for the war, you mean?" he said. "I don't mean that at all. I hate the war." "So do we all." "Not in the way I mean. I hate the cant about it, the smugness, the horrible, horrible patriotism." "Patriotism?" Tommy was startled. "Yes, I hate patriotism. Do you understand? All this country, country, country. Betraying your country, dying for your country, serving your country. Why should one's country mean anything at all?" Tommy said simply, "I don't know, it just does." "Not to me. Oh, it would to you. You go abroad and buy and sell in the British Empire, and come back bronzed and full of cliches, talking about the natives and calling for chota pegs, CHOTA, and all that sort of thing." Tommy said gently, "I'm not quite as bad as that, I hope, my dear. I'm exaggerating a little, but you know what I mean. You believe in the British Empire and the stupidity of dying for one's country." "My country," said Tommy dryly, "doesn't seem particularly anxious to allow me to die for it." "Yes, but you want to, and it's so stupid. Nothing's worth dying for. It's all an idea. Talk, froth, high-flown idiocy. My country doesn't mean anything to me at all." "Someday," said Tommy, "you'll be surprised to find that it does." "No, never. I've suffered. I've seen." She broke off then, turned suddenly and impetuously upon him. "Do you know who my father was?" "No." Tommy's interest quickened. "His name was Patrick McGuire. He was a follower of the casement in the last war. He was shot as a traitor. All for nothing. For an idea, he worked himself up with those other Irishmen. Why couldn't he just stay at home quietly and mind his own business? He's a martyr to some people and a traitor to others. I think he was just stupid." Tommy could hear the note of pent-up rebellion coming out into the open. He said, "So that's the Shadow you've grown up with?" "Shadow's right. Mother changed her name. We lived in Spain for some years. She always says that Father was half Spaniard. We always tell lies wherever we go. We've been all over the continent. Finally, we came here and started this place. I think this is quite the most hateful thing we've done yet." Tommy asked, "How does your mother feel about things?" "You mean about my father's death?" Sheila was silent a moment, frowning, puzzled. She said slowly, "I've never really known. She never talks about it. It's not easy to know what Mother feels or thinks." Tommy nodded his head thoughtfully. Sheila said abruptly, I don't know why I've been telling you this. I got worked up. Where did it all start?" "A discussion on Edith Cavell." "Oh, yes, patriotism." I said I hated it. "Aren't you forgetting Nurse Cavell's own words?" "What words?" "Before she died. Don't you know what she said?" He repeated the words, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred in my heart." "Oh." She stood there stricken for a moment, then turning quickly, she wheeled away into the shadow of the garden. And I'm going to stop right there, because we'll be at the second part. See that little Roman numeral 2 of chapter 4. Good night. Hope to see you tomorrow for Live at 5. Tea with me. Bye-bye. Be sweet. Don't be ugly.